Lecture number 17, Structuralism. This is what you can see on your screens today. Well, this is what we're going to discuss today, the Structuralism, the theory of Structuralism in today's lesson of the course English 504, Linguistics 2. Now, before we discuss what is Structuralism, let's talk about the theories we've talked about so far, or the concepts we've talked about so far. We discussed in detail generativism, or the generative theory, the generative grammar theory, or the transformational generative grammar, as we discussed yesterday in the last lesson, and what transformational generative grammar is. We discussed in detail about this theory given by Noam Chomsky, what the generative grammar is and how it operates, what is the basic idea. And in the last lesson we discussed what were the different kinds of transformations, like how we remove the subject from the passive voice and how we introduce the dummy it or the dummy subject. We also talked about how we put the end focus at the end, end focus at the end of a sentence. So let's first talk about what we discussed in detail in the transformational generative grammar. Now, what were the common transformations that we discussed in the last class? Passive agent deletion, how we remove the subject, we delete the passive agent. Indefinite pronoun introduced instead of subject, we introduce an indefinite pronoun like it instead of subject, like John played cricket, but somebody played cricket. So when in passive voice we say cricket was played. Now here you are not introducing a subject, you are not interested, the listeners are not interested in what is the subject, who played cricket. But once you are looking at the deep structure, once you are analyzing the depth of this sentence, here you introduce a dummy subject. Here you introduce a subject like from your own. Somebody played cricket, John played cricket, Ahmed played cricket. So here you are introducing a subject where it wasn't there. Extra position, subject moved at the end and a dummy it is moved in the initial position. Now here in the second point you are actually introducing it as a dummy subject. For example, it's a good weather, it's raining again. Now in the phenomena of rain or in the phenomena of weather, when you want to talk about weather, you just put the word weather or rain at the end of the sentence, and in the initial point, in the start, you introduce a subject from your own, it is put in the initial position. Then, now the second kind of transformation was end focus, how you put the focus at the end of the sentence. The whole piece is put in the start and the most important information is put at the end. The communicatively important information is put at the end. Like we had a very common example, a very familiar example, Quaid-e-Azam was born in Karachi. So Quaid-e-Azam is the old information who everybody knows about, but Karachi is a new information. You are passing a comment, you are giving a new information about Quaid-e-Azam, so that you put at the end. And focus and genitives, that was the next transformation we discussed in the last lesson. Choice between S genitive and O genitive, the choice made about the possessives, like Ahmed's clothes, Ahmed's friends, or the legs of the table. So how do you make this choice? So here again you look at the more important thing. The more important thing or the more important agent is put at the end. So legs of the table and Ahmed's friends, the more important friends are important. Here you're putting friends at the end. So you're using S and you're using of the related with the importance of the agent. You look at what is the important information and you put generally you put at the end, and that is how you make the choice between S and O genitive. Then finally we talked about the WH clefts. WH cleft is put at a regular position and sometimes it's also reversed, like like you had very familiar and beautiful example as love, what you need is love. All what you need is love. So here, all denotes WH. That is a regular cleft. The regular WH cleft. WH cleft is put at a regular position. All you need is love. But then, love is all you need. Here, you are reversing WH cleft in order to focus more on the word love. You bring it in the start and you bring all in the middle of the sentence. So you are sometimes reversing the WH cleft just to change the focus. Focus on the sentence, focus on a particular word. So here you have two techniques of putting focus, of changing the focus. Either you use the WH cleft in a regular position, or you can just reverse it in order to change the focus. Then we talked about sentence transformations. Now, what are sentence transformations? Sometimes you have grammatically correct sentence, but they may be meaningless. They may not carry a meaning. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. This was the example we had. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Now, it's a grammatically correct sentence, grammatically ordered sentence, but doesn't give us a very clear meaning. It may be an abstract meaning in the mind of the speaker, mind of the person who said it. Noam Chomsky. Sentence comes from Noam Chomsky, so it may have been he may have been under the influence of some abstract idea where he uttered this sentence, colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Doesn't carry a very sensible meaning. But on the other hand, you have a grammatically unordered sentence, but still some meaning comes out of it, some sense comes out of it. Man, snake, bit the. We had the example. And we got a general idea from that. Yes, snakes, they bite men. So then we were able to order that sentence, snake bit man, or the snakes bite men. So these are the sentence transformations where sometimes you get grammatically correct sentence, but they don't give us any sensible meaning. So you transform them and you create meaning out of those sentences. So sentences to be accepted by people, sentences to be called correct sentences and communicatively correct sentences, they must be grammatically correct as well as they must be meaningful. So this is what we talked about in the last lecture. Now, all this idea was generative grammar. All these ideas, they came from generative grammar or the generative theory or the generativism as the concept is called. Now, today we're going to talk about another theory in opposition to which the generatives, they came up with a theory. What was the basic idea of structuralism, against which the generativists, they gave their idea. Now look at the word structuralism. As it's self-explanatory, talking about structure of language, structure of a sentence. Now, what is this movement basically? Let's look at how it started. An identifiable movement in 1916 started with the publication of Ferdinand de Saussures book, A Course in General Linguistics. So here we get the idea, here we clear that the movement was started by Ferdinand de Saussure. Ferdinand de Saussure, father of modern linguistics, as we had this very beautiful title for him. And most of the modern linguistics, we said, is called Saussurian linguistics. It's because of his great contributions to the world of linguistics. Now, his book, The Course in General Linguistics, after that, he came up with a new idea. Scientists now began to study language in terms of observable and verifiable data obtained from the behavior of language users. So now they were taking that data which was observable and which was verifiable. They could verify the facts. They could verify empirically. They could take the data and verify and research over the data and then verify the results. So this was the observable data. There was no underlying consideration, the hidden consideration, or they were not talking about the hidden grammar. They were not talking about the internal processes of the mind. They were talking about the facts which were observed, which could be verified through data. So now they began to study language in terms of observable or in terms of the data which could be verified. Now let's see how they studied this data and what they had in their mind. This new movement was a reaction against the traditional and universal grammar. Now there was a view of traditional and universal grammar. The way traditionalists talk about the grammar, they gave a lot of regard to the written speech, they gave a lot of regard to the literary texts. So that was they called it a very pure language, and they believed in the purity of language. They didn't want to contaminate it, they didn't want to bring new ideas into it, they didn't want to bring different structures into their already established literary texts or the already established written language. So this was the traditional idea. Now this movement was basically a reaction against that traditional concept. An improvement upon historical and comparative studies of languages in the 19th century. This was basically an improvement of the same idea which came from the historical and comparative studies. When language was studied by introducing history, by taking how the language changed over a period of time, or what stages it passed through over the periods, different eras of history, and when the two different languages were compared, that was a concept given in the 19th century, and basically structuralists, they improved upon that concept. They took that concept as a base and then they added to that concept. Now what is basically structural grammar? It is characterized as structural linguistics, as it attempts to describe language used in terms of recurrent elements and recurrent regularities. So the ideas already, the grammars, the language in terms of recurrent elements which occur, which can be seen, which can be heard, which are according to that very situation, and which are regular, which has regularities. So they are talking about the visual thing. They are now taking the language as it is present in visual form, or as it is present at that very time. They are just looking at that language as it is, according to the structure. Now it has been called mechanical. Why is structuralism a mechanical idea? Because the procedure is mechanical. They are applying empirical studies. They are taking the data and verifying it. They are taking the visual data, the data that they get in the form of written speech, in the form of prescriptions. So they apply their techniques to analyze that language, and this is a very mechanical way. This is not they are not introducing anything abstract into that. They are just talking about the real thing, or the machine. It's just like whatever data they are taking and they are studying it objectively. They are not putting their own subjectivity into that. They are not taking into consideration anything that comes from internal grammar, or anything that comes from the internal structures that are present in mind and how the mind can process information. They are just talking about the visual thing. It studies a language employing certain procedures which linguists have formulated, tested and improved. Now see these three words, the key words here: formulated, tested and improved. They are applying those procedures, those scientific procedures. They are formulated, they are tested and they are improved. Now they are applying very scientific procedures to analyze language, to look at the formation of language, the use of language, the acquisition of language. Furthermore, it eschews the mentalist approach, which is based on intuitive analysis of data. It insists on purely objective analysis. Doesn't talk about mind, doesn't talk about the internal feelings. It talks just about the object. It talks about the objective analysis. Whatever is present outside, whatever can be heard, whatever can be observed, right? They are taking that data and they just keep themselves out. They are just talking about the objective analysis of the data or objective analysis of language. Now the structuralists use structure as a slogan and ignored meaning. See, they are talking just about the structure. They are not talking about meaning. Whereas you remember in the last movement, in the last theory which we discussed, generativism, they also talked about meaning. They talked about meaning as well and structure as well. The traditional grammars when you analyze, when you look at them, there was a meaning. They talked about the inner feelings as well, and they talked about the structure as well. But here, the structuralists, their main slogan is structure. They emphasized that language should be studied in a mechanical way. Language is a science. Take each part, study it mechanically, how it was formed. Don't bring into consideration the situations. Don't bring into considerations how it has been transformed. Don't bring into consideration any human feelings or any human emotions, but do study the language in a mechanical way. Linguists should discover various constituents of language like a botanist discovers the petals of a flower. Now you know the study of botany, study of zoology, study of mechanical things, they don't bring into that the feelings or the thoughts. They just take the thing as it is. As a botanist, they just take the plants, they take the petals of flower, and when they are studying flowers, they take these petals and study them visually, study them in the visual form, the way they are visible, the way they can be seen by human eye. They are not going into the depth of how the petals are formed. They are studying it in a mechanical way. So language also, the structuralists said that linguists should discover various constituents of language. They should look at various constituents of language. What constitutes a language? What makes a language? Without bringing it into things which were hidden, or which the considerations, such considerations which are coming from the human feelings, which are coming from the internal grammar. They are just talking about language, talking about the different constituents of language as they are there in that sentence, as they look in apparent form, as they look in visual form. Now, by structure, the followers of Bloomfield meant another name here, Bloomfieldian structuralism. We talked about it in one of our last lessons. So Bloomfield, another supporter of this movement, his followers, Bloomfield followers, meant regularities, patterns or rules of language. So they believed only in regularities. They believed in patterns, the structures. They believe in the rules. What rules are important? They are talking about the rules, they're talking about the design, they're talking about the structure, they're talking about the regular structure. They envisaged language structure in a very precise and limited manner. Now see the word limited here. The rules were very limited, and applying those rules, they studied the language as it is. They did not go to the meaning in depth. They did not consider the deep meanings of sentence. They looked at the surface meaning and they just studied the structure. In particular, it was associated with the phoneme, unit of phonology, and morpheme, unit of grammar. So they were looking at phonemes and the morphemes as they were there. They looked at the sounds. They looked at the sounds as they were there in a sentence, and they looked at the words as they were there in the sentence. So as a unit of phonology, they took phonemes, and as a unit of grammar, they took morpheme, and they studied them as they were present in the sentence. Now, structuralist method implies that first we must find the phonemes and then morphemes, each without any reference to anything not already been empirically established. See the word empirical here. The structuralist method, that believes in empirical data, that believes in things coming out of in the shape of empirical data. the data which is already observed, which is already tested and verified. Now, structuralist method says that first we must find the phonemes and then the morphemes, without any reference to anything not already being empirically established. So whatever is taken in the, if ever you take anything in the background, it has to be empirically tested. It has to be empirically proved, established. You are not taking anything that is not empirically established, that is not scientifically established and verified. If at all you are taking anything apart from phonemes and morphemes, you are just you have to see that it has been tested and observed and verified empirically. You can't take anything, any hidden underlying thing, you can't take any hidden underlying meaning in order to analyze any structure. So take just the apparent structures, the phoneme, the morphemes. After morphological elements have been set up, followed by a statement of their distribution, the structuralists can analyze syntax. Now, once they have looked at the phonemes, then the morphemes, the morphological elements have been set up. They have decided where the words are to be placed. After that, they can analyze the syntax, the sentence structure. So once the morphological elements, the phonological elements before that, they have been established, only then they look at the syntax, or they analyze the syntax at syntax level. So here we see a very mechanical way, talking about the apparent things, talking about the sounds and then the words and then the syntax, without bringing into anything that has not been tested or verified scientifically. Syntax is analyzed into constituents and the relationship in terms of structure that can be stated. Now here you are now analyzing the syntax. The structuralists, what they did, they analyzed it into, broke it into constituents. They looked at each individual word, and then in relationship, in terms of structures that can be stated, that can be defined, that have a proper definition. You can't bring different structures into that. You just have to restrict yourself to the structures already defined, already stated, and your relationship, talking about relationship between words in structures that have been already tested, empirically tested. You can't put them at some other place. You have as a structuralist, the structuralists, what they did was just they studied the syntax, they put the words in the place which is already defined, already fixed, and they can't put any other, they can't have any other consideration into this. Now he has to establish, as a structuralist, he refers to structuralist here, he refers to structuralists. Now he has to establish phonemes without reference to the morphemes, and both phonemes and morphemes without reference to the semantics, meaning. See, here the structuralist is taking each individual unit in a sentence. He's taking the phonemes separately without even thinking about the morphemes. So first the structuralist is studying the sounds. What are the sounds? Then the structuralist is moving towards the words. And when the structuralist is studying the words, is not thinking about the syntax, is not thinking about the sounds. He has already studied the sounds. So the sounds studied, then morphemes. Establish phonemes without reference to morphemes. And then both phoneme and morpheme, when he is analyzing both of them together, he is not thinking about the syntax or semantics. He is not thinking about the meaning. He doesn't care what the meaning is, but he is just putting them at the right place. He is putting the sounds together and he is putting the words together. So he has established phonemes without giving reference to the other level, without giving reference. When you're studying phonemes, no reference to the morpheme level, and when studying both of them together, analyzing both of them together, no reference to semantics or syntax. He is committed to the objective study of a language in its own terms, in order to arrive at an abstract, synchronic description of the organization of the language analyzed. He believes in synchronic description, the language as it exists at that time, without any consideration of the past or the future of that language. He is committed to the objective study. The structuralist remains out of the study, remains out of the structure of a set, keeps his feelings away, keeps his objectivity, opinion away, out of the study. Is committed to the objective study of a language in its own terms, in order to arrive at an abstract synchronic description. He is describing a language without putting into it any other consideration that is not empirically tested, that is not scientifically tested. So any sentence of a language represented as a particular arrangement of the ultimate constituents, minimal grammatical elements of which it is composed. So any sentence of language is represented as a particular arrangement of the ultimate constituents. Ultimate constituents that there won't be any change after that. The final constituents, the final parts would be the same, and minimal grammatical elements of which it is composed, and the elements, the grammatical elements would be the same, they would not be changed, and he is talking just about that same arrangement. And even if he is introducing anything extra, that has to be scientifically proven. It can't be put in without it being empirically tested. Now every sentence, how is it studied? How is it composed? Has a linear structure. You remember, if I want you to look at this word again, if you go back, you see the word committed to the objective study, and the word he has to establish phonemes without reference to the morphemes. Now if he is taking only the phonemes and morphemes, they are in the horizontal direction. There is no consideration of the changes with time. The historical developments have not come into play in the study of structuralists. So is committed to the objective study of a language in its own terms in order to arrive at an abstract synchronic, no diachronic, no mention of history here, no mention of the changes in language because of the changing times. So it's talking only about the linear structure. Attention to structure, study of spoken language, use of inductive method of scientific analysis, and working from form to meaning characterize the work of structural grammarians. Some of the features, some of the characteristics of structural grammar or structuralism: attention to structure. They are looking at structure only. Study of the spoken language. They are looking at language, spoken language. They are paying attention to the spoken language. Use of inductive method of scientific analysis. They are applying the inductive method of scientific analysis, like they are first taking taking a question, a problem, they are designing their data to be verified, and once it is verified, only then they are giving theory. That is the inductive method. From form to meaning, these characterize the work of structural grammarians. So look at this point again. What are the characteristics, salient characteristics of grammarians, structural grammarians? Attention to structure, study of the spoken language, use of inductive method of scientific analysis, and working from form to meaning. These are the salient characteristics of the structural grammarians. Now, how does a structuralist treat grammar? To him, grammar is a device by which the words are combined into larger units of discourse and nothing else. A structuralist treats grammar a device, just a set of rules by which words are joined to make larger units of discourse. Sounds are joined to make words, and words are joined to make sentences, and sentences are joined to make larger discourses. So it's just a device, just a way, just a set of rules that is making all this happen. He analyzes the data by means of inductive methods and formulates a grammar based on discovery procedures of the data. Whatever data he discovers, and he applies the inductive method, he analyzes the data, and then gives the results. So this is inductive method, that he takes a problem, analyzes the data through discovery, through inductive methods, through taking the data and then studying it in a very scientific way, studying it empirically, talking in technical terms, studying it empirical. So all his data is empirical. And then the structuralist gives a theory after that. This is the inductive method. Now, this is what the structural grammarian is doing. He analyzes data by means of inductive methods. Then, some basic assumptions of structuralism. What do they assume when they study grammar? Of course, for every study, you need to have some assumptions. You keep some things in mind before you attempt a problem. So structuralists also had some basic assumptions while they were studying language. The first one we talk about is priority of the spoken language. All the traditional grammarians till the beginning of their century assumed superiority of written form to the spoken form. So this, as we discussed earlier, that structuralism was opposed to the traditional grammar. Now what the traditional grammarians said, they said that the written speech was the most important. Written speech was so pure in their mind. Written speech was given a complete dominance over the oral. They said oral speech doesn't enjoy that importance where as is enjoyed by as a written speech enjoys. So a traditional grammars till the beginning of their century assumed superiority. They said that the written word or the written speech is always superior to the spoken speech. The structural linguists maintain that a spoken form is prior to the written form. Now here, the change of idea, the change of belief. What did the structuralists said? They said no, spoken form comes before written form. First, it was the spoken language that created impact on the world. They said it was basically the school of speakers or the school of philosophers who believed in oral speech first. They said it's basically the sophists, the school of sophists as it's called, that was laying importance to the spoken, and people who could speak well were considered important. So spoken comes before written. You write later, you first speak. A child first speaks and then starts to write. So they said, the structural linguists maintained that spoken form is prior to the written form. That comes before the written form. It must form the main field of linguistic study. So how can we study language? By studying the oral form. By studying the oral form of language. By studying what is oral, how the words are coming in the oral form. So that is basically the basic thing that should be studied in order to study the language, because that precedes written form. Written form came later. So it must form the main field of linguistic study. Today, if you are studying linguistics, the main field should be oral speech rather than written scripts. Now, moving on, we see what was their belief, how they talked about their assumption. They maintain that spoken language is primary and writing is just a means of representing speech in another medium. Look at this. Whatever ideas are there in the mind, whatever concepts are there in the mind, you bring them out in the form of written. It's just, writing is just a means of representing speech in another medium. They said whatever is there, that is important. What you speak, writing is just a medium. What is more important is the oral speech. What is more important is what you speak. So oral speech comes, and then later on when you have to record that, when you have to preserve that, then you just use a medium of writing. So writing doesn't enjoy that importance as the oral speech enjoys. Oral communication is more important than the written communication. Speech is older and more widespread than writing. Speech is older and more widespread than writing. Sophists, as we mentioned the word, the school of philosophers, school of teachers who taught people how to speak well. They taught about the art of speaking, art of public speaking. And then later on another school, the school of rhetoricians, rhetorics, the art of writing, that was formed when these things, whatever the ideas, thoughts, philosophies came in the form of oral, they were to be recorded, they were to be put in a written form. And then another school which taught people how to write well, the school of rhetoricians, or rhetorics as you say, a very common word, rhetorics, the art of writing, that came later. So first, the prime importance lies with the oral communication or oral speech. Speaking is primary. Writing is just a means of representing speech in another medium. Speech is older and more widespread than writing. All systems of writing, except Chinese maybe, are based upon units of spoken language. Now, whatever systems you study, different systems of writing, they are based upon the units of spoken language. Whatever is spoken, they are, or whatever is uttered, they bring the sounds into that, and with the concentration of the sound or the phonetic symbols of phonology, then they write it. So what is more important is the word, how it is spoken, how it is being used. So spoken is much more important than written. This is the idea, the first assumption they had. And they further said, no system of writing can convey or represent all features of speech. Writing is limited boundary. Writing has limited scope. Writing has limitations. Writing cannot convey all the features of speech. Speech is much wider. Speech has larger boundaries. Speech has wider sphere. Speech cannot be fully communicated through writing. Writing has limitations. Writing has limited boundaries. The extra linguistic features like gestures are missing in writing. Now look here, the non-verbal skills, they can't be conveyed in writing. When you are speaking, you are also using non-verbal communication. You are also using the hands, the gestures, the movement of the head, your body movement. You are moving around talking. You are also using the facial expressions. So all this can be introduced in speaking, not in writing. Writing is devoid of all that. Writing is mechanical. Writing is just gives the surface meaning. So when you're speaking through the expressions, sometimes you can even experience a different statement. Sometimes you can experience the situations changing because of the facial expressions. So sometimes the facial expressions have to be matched with what a person is saying. And sometimes the facial expressions, they don't convey the words which are being spoken. So spoken is very important because it has the consideration of non-verbal skills as well, or the non-verbal communication as well. So the dependence on written language promoted prescriptivism. What is prescribed, written, and language teaching devoid of actual speech habits of the day. Whatever language is taught, when we go to the domain of language teaching, it doesn't have the actual speech habits of the day. The teacher may speak, the teacher may teach and speak words and then refer to the written speech. The teacher, whatever dependence on the written language, promoted prescriptivism, and language teaching became the divide of actual speech habits of the day, because a child may speak so many other words when the child moves out of the class. The child interacts with people. The child interacts with society. A person, a learner, adult learner, may not be restricted to the book, may not be restricted to the words being taught, but actually when the adult learner interacts with people in the society, there are so many other words that a learner might learn, the learner might speak or use them in his life. So basically, you can't depend on the written language. Written language is just talking about what is prescribed. What is written is there. That's it. But languages change, as you know, the habits change, the communication styles change, the languages change, the varieties of languages change, depending on the culture sometimes, depending on the place of that speaker in society, depending on the movement of that person in society, depending on his interaction with different people. So there are changes, and these changes cannot be conveyed in written speech all the time. So language promoted prescriptivism, and language teaching was devoid of actual speech habits of the day. Structuralists changed it successfully. Structuralists gave a different idea. They introduced variation. They said, well, written is not as important as spoken. No. They gave an objective treatment of all to the two languages. They said there should be objectivity. Language should be taught as it is. Language should be considered, and language should be analyzed as it is. All languages are structurally complex and completely adequate to the needs of a speech community. So all the languages are very complex, they are structurally complex, they have complex structures, and they are in fact adequate enough to the needs of speech community. The speech community has enough words to survive. The speech community is sufficiently equipped with those words or language which help the speech community to survive, the speech community to communicate. So it's structurally complex, but it's completely adequate to the needs of speech community. Descriptive linguists took every language as an equal manifestation of the structure of human language. So they said it's equal to the structure of human language. Every language is just like the structure of human language. Whatever people speak, that is basically the language that is important, and they speak in that very situation. The language that is coming out in that very situation, that is basically important, that carries the emphasis, that should be studied. And descriptive linguistics, they took every language as an equal manifestation of the structure of human language. Whatever structure of the human language is, basically that is important, and every language is sufficiently equipped with all the structures that can help a human being survive in a society. Now, the third consideration, the third assumption, importance of synchronic description. Traditional and historical grammars, they are grammarians, they are interested in diachronic, through time, studies of the language. What did the traditional grammarians believe on? They believed on the historical involvement or the role of history in the study of language. They said languages, they depend on their past, how they were in the past and how they will be in future. So they introduced the historical element in the study of language. They introduced the traditional concept in the study of language. So they said the traditional and historical grammarians, what did they say? They said that language should be studied with reference to its past, with reference to its future, with reference to its time, with reference to history. Now, structuralists focused on the language of the day as it is present on that day. Structuralists did not talk about the past or the future. They didn't talk about the time consideration. They didn't consider the changes of history on the language. They didn't bring history into the study. They said, take language as it exists now. Take language as it is being used now in this situation. So this is called, of course we know, synchronic approach or the synchronic study, usage of day or time of study. You are using that very time. You are taking that very time when a certain sentence is uttered. So you are not basically taking into consideration what has happened to that sentence, how this sentence was in the past, and how it has developed to attain this shape, how this word was in the past, and how what was the pronunciation of this word, what were the spellings of this word, and now how the pronunciation has changed, why it has changed, through which changes this word or sentence has passed to attain its present shape. So this is all basically the concept of traditionalists. They took the history as an agent which had effect on the language, but here the structuralist approach is different. They took it synchronically as it exists at that very moment. The sentence, when it was uttered, what was the context, what was the meaning, right? They don't talk about how this sentence has transformed, how this sentence has changed over the period of time. Now, linguists, the fourth assumption, linguists, they are descriptive, not prescriptive science. Linguistics, structuralists said that linguistics is not descriptive, it is descriptive. It is how it is described at that very time. It is not prescriptive science. It is not as it has been prescribed. It has been written by people. So that is why they are laying more focus on the spoken rather than written. So what is basically the descriptive grammar? The grammar as it is described at that very time. And prescriptive, they put the history into that, the way the word has been written, the way the word has been written by an historian, or the way the word has been produced by the writers. You have the same word. That is the actual thing. That is the actual way to talk about language. But structural linguists did not believe in that. They said it's descriptive. The way you describe language is descriptive. Linguistics is descriptive. It describes the language as it exists. It doesn't talk about the past or the future. No. On the contrary, traditional grammarians assumed that written language was more fundamental than the spoken language. A different view, the opposite view of the traditionals. They said that written language is more important, more holy, more sacred. They even had a language, literary language, the language used in literature, the language used in poetry, in the novels, in the plays. They said this language is sacred. This language is pure. We must not make it impure. We must not contaminate the language by bringing words from the other ages, bringing words from the other languages. Language is pure and it belongs to that very time and it belongs to that very area. So literary language, they said, was purer and more correct than any other forms of language. They had a variety of English called literary language. The language which was used by poets, the language which was used by the fiction writers, the language which was used by the playwrights. So that language, they really graded it very high. They gave a prime importance to that language, and they gave superiority of that language over the other languages. They said this is the most pure and more correct than any other language, any other forms of language. Traditional grammarian considered his duty to preserve the pure grammar and save it from corruption. Now, what did traditional grammarian consider? Considered that it was his duty to preserve, to save grammar, to preserve the grammar, pure grammar, and save it from corruption. Look at the word, they called it corruption. They said when you modify language, when you bring other structures into it, when you bring other considerations into it, you're basically contaminating language. You're basically making it impure. They considered grammar as a set of normative prescriptive rules. This was the traditional grammarians. They said it is a set of normative norms, and they said that it is prescribed rules. Grammar is what has already been prescribed. Grammar is what has already been written about it. So it's a written grammar, or it's a written set of rules. They talk about the rules. whereas structuralists treated language as a descriptive science, a science which describes things as they are. So they are the structuralists. They had a different approach, they had a different view. They talked about what language exists or how language existed at a particular time, and it is just like science, because it talks about all those things which have been empirically, scientifically tested and verified. All right. The next assumption, system structure. The structural linguists describe the organization or the pattern or the system or the structure of the language under scrutiny. What are the, look at these four different words. Organization, how the structure has been organized. The pattern, the design in which a sentence has been formed. Or the system, the whole system of rules, the laws, the rules, how it has been, how a sentence has been arranged. And the structure of the language under scrutiny. And the whole structure, how it has built up. Small structures have contributed to make a big structure of language. So all this comes in the structuralist approach, comes in the structuralist domain. They said that a system structure, it's a system with structure. It is a system with structure. He says that the most striking feature of the human language is complexity of structure. The most striking feature, the most dominant feature here of human language. What is the most powerful thing in your human language? That is the complexity of structures. Whatever structures you are uttering, whatever structures you're communicating to people, whatever sentences you are communicating, whatever sentences you are uttering, basically they have that complex structure, and this is the most striking feature of the human language. No other language has so much complexity of structures. Our brain is full of complex structures, and we keep on uttering words, we keep on changing the language, we keep on changing the sentences, the orders of the sentences, because we have a complex structure in our mind. And also, that the most striking feature of the human language. This is the most important part of the human language. The study of language was based on the empirical evidence. As we already said, the study was based on the evidence coming from the data, scientific data, analysis of data. So empirical evidence was basically the thing which gave us a proper language, empirical evidence which helped us to put the things together, which helped the structuralists, in fact, to put the things together and design structure of a language. The next point, the next basic assumption with the structuralists is that language and utterance. Structuralists maintained clear distinction between lang and parole. They were very clear in their mind that there is a set of rules, lang, and parole is basically the utterance, how the words come out, how the sentences have come out, and what is basically at the background, what is the lang, and de Saussure called it lang, the rule of language, the rules, a set of rules of language, and how they are used in a proper way to give utterances. So they maintained a clear distinction between lang and parole, language and utterance. Language is something else and utterance is something else. So basically structuralists, they maintain a very clear distinction between the two. Language is an abstraction of a system. Parole is an instance, manifestation in contextual demonstration of the principles of work. Saussure indicated difference between the two. Saussure indicated, clarified the difference between lang and parole. Parole performance, lang the set of rules. So indicated a very clear difference between them. He proposed that the descriptive linguist task was to state relationship between actual speech acts and their recurring pattern. So what is basically the descriptive linguist doing? He is describing language in terms of their relationship, in terms of the relationship between the different parts of the speech, or between the actual speech acts and their reckoning and how they have been put together, how different words have been put together. So a descriptive linguist is basically talking about the relationship between the parts, among the parts, different constituent parts. To a structuralist, language is not the same as an utterance. It is an abstraction system at work, and the other is an instance, semi-manifestation of the principles at work. Language is not the same as utterance. It is basically a full system at work. Abstract system is at work, constantly at work, giving us language, constantly at work in helping the linguist put the words in order, put the sentences in order. The other is an instance, semi-manifestation of the principles of work. The other part, the other system is basically just an instance. It's a semi-manifestation of the principles of work. What is the other system? The other system is basically what is just a chance, it's an instance, and it's a semi-representation. It manifests. What does it manifest? The principles which are at work. So, strengths of structuralism. This is what we have on this slide. Now, definitely, every theory, every concept, every idea does have some strengths, but it goes weak in some other areas. So, structuralism also had some positive points, and on the other hand, did have some negative points as well. Now here, let's talk about what positive contribution structuralism had. What positive things structuralism gave us. Chomsky says the major contributions of structural linguists is methodological rather than substantive. The major contribution of structural linguistics is talking about method, how the method is employed to form language, how the way, the rule is employed to give language, rather than substantive. It doesn't talk about the substance, doesn't talk about what is inside, doesn't talk about the inner thing. It talks about the structure, it talks about the method, the rule. It made study of language scientific, precise, verifiable, and objective. Of course, brought some new things into study of language, brought a new revolution in the study of language. It made language scientific, it made language precise, it made language verifiable and objective. All these qualities, they kept the linguist, or kept the language people working on language, they kept the linguists out of that. All this thing, because it was objective, it was verifiable. The linguists, the structuralists, just employed the inductive method. They just collected the data from people, and after collecting the data, they applied inductive methods. They applied scientific methods to analyze that data. So, language became precise, exact. It became verifiable. You could verify each part of language, each constituent of sentence. It was very objective. There was no subjectivity, no personal opinion, no feelings, no thoughts, human feelings, no human thoughts in that. So this is the contribution, someone talking about the positive contribution, that this is the strength of this area, that they made language as a scientific study. People grew more interested in studying language. People had rules to study language. People had different ways to analyze a sentence. So they came out with certain ways, they came out with certain exact rules to study language. This was one of the strong points of this theory. It took living dialect for the study and analyzed its features. So living dialect means that the dialect which is present at that very time, the dialect which is being used at that very time, not the dead dialect, not the language which is gone, not the language of the past, but it took a living dialect, the dialect which is being used there and at that very time, and analyzed its features, looked at each constituent part of it, and studied and gave theory. So this is basically a strength of structuralism, that it took a dialect, it took a language, it took the form of language which is present at that very time, and doesn't put other things into it, and analyzes the structuralism, analyzes the dialects, analyzes the living dialect, and gives us the different constituent parts, different role of the different sentences in language, or different roles of words, phonemes or morphemes in a sentence. Aim: begin with raw data and arrive at a grammatical description of the corpus, and therefore of the language. What is the aim of structuralism? What is their aim? It begins with raw data, the data which is not formed, which doesn't have a proper form, a data which is just structure. It could be a collection of structure, it could be a bunch of structures, a bunch of sounds, and then after analysis you get a proper grammatical description of the whole text, how the sounds they are put together to make sentences, to make words, and how the words are put together in sentences, and how the sentences are put together in a full text. So you can describe each word independently, you can describe each sentence independently, you can describe each text independently, and this is how you are basically studying the structure of language. First, the elements like phonetic, morphemic and syntactic are set and then stated their descriptions. So first they put the phonemes, the morphemes and the syntax or the sentences at the right order, and then they take each one of them individually, and then they study each one of them individually. Lastly, syntax is analyzed into constituents, and their relationships is given in terms of structure. So they are analyzed, syntax is taken and then broken into constituents. So each constituent is then studied independently, and the relationship is always given in the terms of the structure, the proper structure of any sentence or proper structure of any text or discourse. The structural linguist is committed to the objective study of the language. Of course, we talked about this point again, that they are just not putting themselves into this study, they are remaining out, and they just the structuralists, they give us whatever data they get through the empirical study. Structuralist linguist is empirical, makes exactness to a methodological requirement. They talk about the method, they talk about the way, they talk about the rules, they talk about the proper way or manner, they talk about the structure. It insists that all definitions be publicly verifiable and reliable. They're very careful in that anything they talk should be valid. Anything they say should be verified. And any idea they give, any theory they give is publicly verifiable. Anybody could verify that. And it's reliable. People agree to that. People rely on this idea. So the structuralists are very careful about this. Structuralism examines all language in terms of their phonological and grammatical systems. They examine all the languages in terms of their phonology and grammar, the phonemes and morphemes. It recognizes uniqueness of each language because of structural description. It also facilitates comparison. Now, what does it recognize? It recognizes the uniqueness of each language. Each language is unique. Each language has unique structures, and because of this structural description, it also facilitates you can also compare the two languages because they are not overlapping structures. Each language has a distinct structures, has distinct features, so that is how you can even compare the two languages, because there is no overlapping thing, there is no common factor which would interfere in the comparison, in the process of comparison of languages. So structuralism has given identity, a unique identity to structures. It has given unique identity to sentences. Alright, now summing up what we had today. Study of language in terms of observable and verifiable data obtained from the behavior of language users. Language is studied in terms of observable and verifiable data. The data which we get from the behavior of language users, the data which we practically hear, the language which we practically hear in our everyday life, we take that data and we verify it. This is structuralism. This new movement was a reaction against the traditional and universal grammar. Traditional and universal grammar, they gave importance to the written scripts. They gave importance to the prescriptions. They said language is prescriptive rather than descriptive. It studies a language employing certain procedures. Structuralism studies language employing certain procedures which linguists have formulated, tested and improved. That is very important. They have taken all those ideas which they have formulated, which they have tested, empirically tested, and they have also improved upon them. So it studies language employing certain procedures. Even the tests they apply are empirical. They believe more in the validity. They believe more on the scientific approach. That is also only the valid approach. This is the view given by structuralists. A structuralist treats grammar as a device by which words are combined into larger units of discourse. It is a device. A grammar is a way, is a procedure, it's a device, a machine, a tool by which words are combined into larger units of discourse. Basic assumptions taken. Of course, the structuralists had some basic assumptions while talking about this idea. Priority was given to the spoken language. Objective treatment of all the languages. Importance of synchronic description rather than diachronic. No involvement of historical developments of language. Only synchronic. Study of language as it exists. Linguistics is descriptive, not prescriptive. It is as it is described. Language as described, that is the idea of structuralists. Language not as already written and prescribed is not their belief. Science, system structure. It's a system structure. It's a prescriptive science, not a prescriptive science. Linguistics is a descriptive science, and it's a system. It has a structure. Language and utterance. Language and utterance, they believe that what is important is utterance. How the spoken words come out, how a speaker communicates looking at different situations. So this is basically, these are basically the assumptions which the structuralists had, and we also talked about the strengths of this theory. And Chomsky says that the major contribution of structural linguists is methodological rather than substantive. It made study of language scientific, precise, verifiable and objective. One of the main strengths of this theory was they took language as precise. They made language precise, and they took only those things to study language which were verifiable. They gave us verifiable facts. They gave us the facts which were empirically proven and which scientifically there had been tests. The facts which had already had a scientific investigation, and they were considered valid and they were considered reliable. It examines all the language in terms of their phonological and grammatical systems, and it recognizes uniqueness of each language. This is the biggest strength, that it has given a unique identity to the language, uniqueness to each language. This is structuralism. Today, what we talked about the theory, structuralism, against which we had a theory, generativism. Generativism, they talked more about the structure and meaning both. But here we have a theory, the people who were talking about the structure, the individual structure of each constituents. Now, does this theory only have strengths? No. Every theory is likely to have criticism. So people criticize this theory. The theory also is weak in certain aspects, and it does have strengths and weaknesses. We're going to talk about the weaknesses in the next class, and see how whether the strengths are more or the weaknesses are more, and how what different criticism was there against this theory. We'll proceed with by giving the weaknesses. We'll see about the value, the importance of this theory or the role of this theory in linguistics, and we'll also have more theories like functionalism and some more theories, some other theories which had an impact on the study of language. So till the next lecture, where we are going to discuss the weaknesses of structuralism plus another theory which will of course give us a different idea. It's goodbye from here. That is the end of this lecture.